You're with Julian on the Brown Note and a review of the Baz Luhrmann film Elvis. And Baz Luhrmann is a director that I have almost entirely detested throughout his career. And this is another of my Guy Ritchie and Edgar Wright moments where I've paid out on their films so much and suddenly had this Nirvana moment. So I just don't care about his entire filmography. Like, Strictly Boring, couldn't give a stuff. Romeo and Juliet, couldn't give a stuff. Moulin Rouge, couldn't give a stuff. Australia was... Yeah, I didn't watch most of these films, to be honest. No interest in his style. The one thing I really liked was the Get Down, the TV show, which was about the birth of hip-hop in America, and incredibly ambitious. So his whole gambit is that his movies are incredibly ambitious, and he's a modern auteur. He's the guy that will shape a singular vision like the auteurs of old, and his entire filmmaking personality will be on screen, for better or worse, and that has never quite worked. I really like the Get Down, but the first film that was really interesting for me was The Great Gatsby. One thing that he does is he takes incredibly ambitious projects and makes money out of them. He actually has triggered a nerve with the public with virtually everything. The build up to The Great Gatsby was that it was going to be this colossally expensive disaster. It was not. It was a huge commercial success, as was Moulin Rouge, as was Romeo and Juliet. Australia was really the one blip. And he's got this style which is so unwieldy, which is incredibly hyperkinetic and colourful and overfilled with life. He's almost like in the same world as the Wachowskis, where they take on these singular projects and just go hell for leather, and no one can stop them. They're these unstoppable trains of colour and visual dazzling and editing and everything. And none of them had worked. But the weird thing about The Great Gatsby was, even though the first half of it was one of the worst films I've ever seen, the second half of it was really good. And I did postulate at the time as to whether there were two separate directors involved. I don't know. But he's come back with a Elvis biography. And it's a curious timing, because basically what happened is Elvis was the biggest star in the universe in history, and gradually the songwriting band took over from him. He was from an era where the songwriter was a nobody, and where the performer was all, and even the instrumentalists were nobody. Everything was a performer. And when the Beatles came through, they kind of swept this broom, and Elvis became less and less important over the decades, where the Beatles still are. So it's a really, I think, timely look at Elvis Presley, because he's not been in the cultural forefront at all. That kind of singer-songwriter, he appeared in lots of cheesy movies, and there's no Elvis Presley albums that are really, other than the Sun Sessions, there's not really any classic Elvis Presley albums that people hold up. Here's your inroad into Elvis Presley. It's a hugely scattered discography. Obviously everyone on earth knows who he is, but so we get like the modern biopic. I mean, for some reason, this is an incredibly standard biopic. The modern biopic is always it's a letdown. They'll always focus on like a couple of years in someone's life, and that's the whole story, instead of giving us this chronological start to end story, which Baz Luhrmann does here, which I was quite surprised by and impressed by. Look at the Steve Jobs one, where it focused on a few random points in his life, and it was just very unsatisfying, because sometimes you want to go through the whole milieu of everything that happened to them. This does, which I was very surprised by. It's been polarizing, but one person that stood out is Austin Butler as Elvis Presley. He gives a superb performance, and the other is Tom Hanks as Colonel Tom Parker, whose performance has been ridiculed as the worst of Tom Hanks' entire career, very much based around his persona and accent, which are very odd. And the whole film is really about the relationship between Colonel Tom Parker, the famous manager of Elvis Presley, his dominance of Elvis Presley, and to a degree him destroying Elvis Presley's career for his own benefit. But this film is remarkably humanizing to both sides. So we join Elvis before he's sort of come of age musically, and it's very well defined as an opening where Colonel Tom Parker is a circus barker, basically involved in country music, and he sees that sex sells as soon as Elvis Presley comes onto these small town stages and drives the local teenage girls wild. The 50s were the first real era of the teenager, where, you know, from Rebel Without a Cause and rock and roll, all of these things sort of focusing on the teenager being, or the young adult actually being a genre of life, rather than you finish school and then you're an adult and you go off and do your apprenticeship or your job or your college or whatever. Here now there was the leading cultural movement was the teenager, the rock and roll, the movies, the movie stars. All of this had taken over and was embodied by Elvis Presley. And there's lots of interest in the basic chronological story as well. Things like how he was only really popular for a couple of years before it all went to hell in a handbasket, and he never got it back, which I found that quite heartbreaking. He explodes across America, and I don't know how well this film deals with race. It feels pretty good, because a big part of what it shows about Elvis Presley, even though he has been regarded as a bit of a Republican and a bit of a racist since then, or at least a conservative, and hated the Beatles and all of this stuff, it does show that his music was intertwined with black culture at the time, and that the right-wing forces in America wanted to tear him apart for breaching, you know, segregation between white culture and black culture, which I found really interesting. And after a couple of years, he was booted into the army. You imagine that happening now? That was what was happening to people who were usually black. Look at Cassius Clay getting sent to jail at the height of his powers for refusing to go to war in Vietnam. And in Elvis Presley's case, it's painted very much here that they couldn't handle his sexuality. He couldn't handle his sexuality. He couldn't handle the fact that he bridged the gap between white and black. So he was given sort of, you know, we're going to arrest you and charge you with obscenity, or you're going to go and be goody two shoes for 2 years in Germany and come back as this, you know, much, you know, more family-friendly version of Elvis. And really those 2 years were the only 2 years that he had that were pure. Because he came back and he was forced he wanted to be a serious actor, but he was forced to do all these terrible sing-along movies, endlessly, 3 a year. And his stock just went down and down and down, because people like the Beatles had moved in and taken over. And he was an anachronism before bounding back into contention at the end of the decade with his Las Vegas stints, and, you know, embracing, you know, gospel and soul, and doing these very famous live, you know, Elvis Presley in the sequin jacket stage of his career. And before it all sort of tumbled downhill, and in the movie, that's sort of when we realised this. Like, one of the tragic things I never knew about Elvis Presley, other than his stint in the army in Germany, he virtually never went overseas in his whole life. He was desperate to tour international. He never played a gig outside of America. I never even knew that. And it's painted in the film here as Colonel Tom Parker blocked him from doing so with excuse after excuse. And towards the end of the film, we realised that Colonel Tom Parker had arrived under a cloud from somewhere, which is possibly from Holland, and possibly wanted by the law, and didn't have a passport and was an illegal immigrant, so could never go on these overseas trips. I don't know how true that is. A lot of it seems to ring true, and the Elvis Presley estate seemed very happy with the way that things were portrayed. Tom Hanks has said that the biggest surprise that he had is that the Elvis Presley estate, including his wife, were actually really fond of Colonel Tom Parker. He's become synonymous with, is it Lisa Marie Presley? That's the daughter, isn't it? Priscilla Presley, who's actually quite fond of him. all of them were fond of him and said that he was actually really nice. He had something like, in modern day money, $150 million in gambling debts to these Las Vegas casinos, and tried to keep Elvis in there for as long as possible. A deeply flawed man, and obviously he took an awful lot of money out of the Elvis Presley estate, but ended up destitute and dying in something like 1989, just playing slot machines in Vegas. But they seem actually really fond of him, and you know, there's a lot that they regard the journey that Elvis went on as being part of Colonel Tom Parker's doing as well. I don't know if I'm sold. I don't know if I'm sold that this firebrand at the start, being sent into the army and then coming back and doing a decade of really cheesy movies, and just, you know, then doing this stint in Vegas. All of it seems to have had a big impact on his downward spiral into prescription medication and so on. But he desperately wanted to tour the world and was never allowed to even play overseas, which is really heartbreaking. So what do I think of this film? I'm absolutely in shock when I watched it. Baz Luhrmann's got one of the most unwieldy laser cannons of talent that has destroyed virtually every film it's touched. This time, he seems to have actually got control of his talent and made his most focused film, utilising all of the great things that he brings to the table, and not just creating this ungodly mess which destroys everything in its path. I found this a very tight narratively film. Every 10 minutes there's so much. It's nearly 3 hours long, but every 10 minutes there's so much filmmaking. Yes, this film is really surface level. No, none of the characters beyond Tom Hanks and Austin Butler are developed in any way. It's surface noise. But if you appreciate the artistry and craft of filmmaking, it's astonishing, a work of art. Visually, editing, sonically, it's amazing. It packs so much into every single minute. It's incredible stuff, and it's not like, sometimes he's between Michael Bay and that whole disastrously frenetic, over-edited filmmaking style, and something like the Technicolor Wachowskis. Here, it's never over the top. The editing is quite symphonic. And so is the cinematography. It looks amazing. I found the screenplay to be really well put together. There are elements where he will go methodically through, you know, this month, and there are others where he'll sort of paint over a big canvas of an entire decade. I thought his artistry was amazing in this film. I think it's the best Baz Luhrmann film. It's the only great Baz Luhrmann film. I haven't seen Strictly Ballroom. I couldn't tell you. I haven't seen Romeo and Juliet either. I've seen like half an hour here or there. So, you know, for me, it is the flowering of Baz Luhrmann finally getting hold of this unwieldy maniac elephant that is his filmmaking talent and turning it into a really successful, hugely enjoyable film that I am shocked that I really liked. I'm going to give Elvis 8.5 out of 10.